I remember going back to my old primary school in England and meeting Miss Jones, who had an incredible influence on my life. And even as I think I was in my early 30s at the time, I just didn't know what to do when I met her. Like I remember we went through a particularly challenging, particularly traumatic time in our family life when I was in her class. And every time I walked into her class, she was my year 4 teacher, I just felt so valued and so known by her. And I'm sure she did that with the 35 other kids that were in her class. But for me, I just felt so incredibly special. And when I went back and saw her 20 years later or whatever it was, I was even more so, 25 years later, I was almost starstruck. I didn't know what to do. I think I just gave her a hug and burst into tears. And it was my wife was there, and when we left, she said, yeah, that really was cool.
It was not a professional look.
And it just goes to show, though, the immense impact that teachers can have on people's lives, and especially with your drama teacher, like just seeing the impact that she's had and how that served you throughout your life is really, really interesting. And do you think there are some parallels between drama and maths? Because it does seem like a sort of an unusual trajectory to go from someone who was maybe more of a drama brain, and then I don't know. Talk to me a little bit about that. What was that trajectory like?
People do often comment on the fact that drama is one piece of the puzzle. My other favorite subject at school, given what I just mentioned about the history of I didn't have an amazing experience of maths, sort of alongside drama, English and history were my real loves at high school, and I did excel at those, and I knew it, and just deeply enjoyed going as far down that rabbit hole as I possibly could. And people frequently comment on how these are strange bedfellows with mathematics teaching. Like, how did that happen? Did you accidentally fill out the wrong form on the enrollment or something like that? You asked about points of commonality. Yeah, there are huge points of commonality. For me, the one that comes up, first in the surface is that drama's about telling a story, right? And I think, I learn mathematics most effectively when I understand it in terms of a story. So, for example, one of the most classic ways that we can think about this is, even though not all stories fit into this, there's a good reason why so many of them do. The 3-act structure that we often find stories, there's setup, there's conflict, and then there's a resolution of some kind, right? It's like there's a reason why screenwriters use this as kind of like their bread and butter, because if you don't set up, then you won't care about the people or the setting or the situation. If there's no conflict, it's just boring. And if there's no resolution, you come out dissatisfied and frustrated and what was the point of that, right? So these 3 pieces to a good story, to the arc of a story, I think they are the same pieces that go into a mathematical proof or a concept or an idea or a skill that I want to teach my students. I want to say, okay, we're not just going to be learning about the quadratic formula today. We're going to say, you know what? There's this ancient problem that human beings have been trying to solve for centuries that was just kind of out of reach. They were trying to understand life, planning it out in 2 dimensions. Maybe you're planning out a farm. Maybe you're trying to design, a tapestry or something like that. You're trying to understand things with height and width. And anytime you have 2 dimensions, you will create equations and relationships that we call quadratic equations. There's x squareds and 5x and all these kinds of things. This is the material of which the universe is made. The conflict is that these are fiendishly difficult to solve. If I gave you something like, okay, Matt, I want you to buy some donuts for me, and here's some money, just buy the right amount of donuts. There's not 2 things there, there's just the amount of money that will get you to the right amount of donuts, and then solved, right? But if I asked you, okay, well, hold on a second, now I want you to not just do donuts, I also want you to, I'm feeling guilty for this dessert that I'm buying, get me some carrots as well. And suddenly you're like, hold on, now I've got these 2 things in contrast with each other. This is a challenging problem. People have literally worked with these for centuries and have said, well, some of them can't be solved. How are we going to, as 13, 14-year-old children, come up with a way to wrestle with these problems? There's a conflict. And then there is this wonderful, delightful resolution, this formula that kind of takes this insoluble challenge and makes it as straightforward as tying your shoelaces. That is brilliant to know that such a challenging thing the ingenuity of the human mind has come up with a way to make this simple and routine. So for me, seeing those commonalities of storytelling and narrative, I think that's a starting point, but there's a lot of those kinds of overlap that you can see between things like drama and maths.
Wow, that's so exciting. And I want to know more now about quadratic equations. I never thought I would say that. But it's so wonderful. And I remember queuing up in a I'm not sure what bookshop, but in a bookshop to purchase your book. I think it might have been one in Liverpool. And I remember catching the train back home and just sitting on the train and looking through your incredible book and seeing just how practical and beautiful and creative and wonderful and intriguing maths was. And it was actually a moment for me at discovering your work and also discovering your book. It was a moment that I felt like the scales had come off, and I was like, oh, it was like a breath of fresh air. And I'm so grateful that you would take the time to speak to not only a generation of students, but also a generation of adults that are quite possibly suffering some sort of an anxiety around mathematics. And I think probably one of the most brilliant opening lines I've ever heard at a TED Talk was from you as well, which it could have gone the way, because you started off saying, I love mathematics. Was that a dangerous move when you were trying to win over an audience, or or was it a carefully constructed opening line? Because I heard that and I thought, he's either genius or it's not going to go well.
Well, I mean, yeah, it was an interesting process. I mean, you talk about writing a book, by the way, I'm so delighted to hear that was your response, because unlike you and me when we're in the classroom, if you give a great lesson, you give a banger of a lesson, or if you give a terrible lesson, you know immediately, like you find out within seconds, right? And I remember that obviously you write a book, you put it out there into the ether, and I was like, I hope this means something to someone out there, and I often don't get to meet the people who've interacted with it, so I'm so glad that that was your experience. But when you come to think about TED, I remember like many other people out there, I've watched many a TED Talk and found them so thought-provoking and challenging, and you talked about the scales falling off your eyes. I definitely have had plenty of those moments where you're like, I've never looked at the world that way before. So when I was, I was approached and said, hey, would you be interested in doing something like this? I was immediately terrified because I thought, I don't think I'm up to that. Because, you look at these incredibly polished performers, and there was a very detailed curatorial process and editing process that went into that. It was considered for me. I knew that I wanted to lead with transparency and to say, like, here I am, you're going to get me as kind of honestly and openly as you're willing to take me. But I remember writing that and feeling okay with it, because it's kind of the reverse punchline to a joke. So I knew I could get a laugh out of people, which is a nice way to get at ease with people. But the thing that really scared me actually was when I gave my talk. I'd already sent my script through, they gave me some feedback, and then they said, okay, we're gonna get you to give it a dry run. We're gonna get every speaker to do a dry run. And then I did it, and they came back and said, okay, thanks for doing that. We've now outlined the program, the order of all the speakers. There's something like 15 or 16 speakers. And I said, oh, cool. So where have you placed me on the order? And they said, yeah, you're the first speaker. And I had the exact same words running through my mind that you did. I was like, this is either going to be amazing or the worst idea that anyone has ever come up with, because would you really lead with that? But it was an instant relief when I actually heard the audience laugh with me, and it was just a wild ride. Some of the scariest 12 minutes of my life, but really enjoyed them.